All right, so welcome everyone after lunch. I hope you all have energy for the remaining panels of the day. And this panel examines motherhood during the Holocaust. We have three wonderful panelists. Two of our presenters will be joining us online, and one is here with us in person. And we will start in the order that you see here. Starting with Professor Dalia Ofer. Professor Dalia Ofer, I'm sure for all of us, does not need a long introduction. We all know her and her work. She is the Max and Rita Haber Professor Emerita of Holocaust and East European Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and the former director of the Abraham Harman Institute of Contemporary Jewry, and of the Vidal Sassoon International Research Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism. She held positions at various universities, had prestigious fellowships that I will not name, and you have them in your in the bio. She is, of course, among the trailblazers in the study of women and the Holocaust, and I'm sure you all know the book that she co-edited with Lenore Weitzman about women in the Holocaust. And in 2018, Professor Ofer received the Distinguished Achievement Award in Holocaust Studies from the Holocaust Educational Foundation at Northwestern University. So, Professor Ofer, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Just to be sure, you hear me, yeah?
Yes,
can you hear
yes,
me?
We hear you.
Okay. So first of all, thank you very much. I listened to the sessions in the morning, and I really enjoyed it very much, despite the situation that we are experiencing here in Israel now. And I will move right away to what I have to say on the subject. I hope that I will keep the time, if not, just stop me. I will start with a number of general comments about the situation of parents and mothers in particular, and then I will move to some examples found in the diaries or contemporary writing from which I can learn about the different modes or the different ways or the different way that people looked at mothers, and from this to understand the issue of motherhood. I would like to start with a comment of Zeli Kalmanovich from the Vilna Ghetto, who claimed that the ghetto itself contradicted all human values. Thus, the foundation was of the values in the ghetto was to be thought in the pre-ghetto world and in the value system of the pre-ghetto world. The knowledge and awareness of the value system, despite the inapplicability to ghetto life, led the individual to struggle and adopt in the ghetto the tributes of womenness, in our case perhaps the issue of parenthood and motherhood, and they remembered it from the previous life or from the previous world. So I think that we should keep this in mind, looking at the hard and difficult situation of a ghetto, regular, routine, daily life. I will not describe now, despite what the Kalmanovich have said, I will not describe the value and the role and the norms of a Jewish family, the tradition and the changes that occurred in the modern time. I wrote about it in other articles of mine, but I will try only to center mostly of the mothers, although fathers also deserve, and if we look at gender, we have to look at fathers and mothers, but this lecture is dedicated to mothers. I wrote about fathers in another article. And from this, I will describe the mode of motherhood from children's perspective, from a perspective or a narration of somebody from that was neither a mother, not a parent yet, and not even married, and from a personnel of the medical world that experienced handling with the mother, and then I will try to come to some conclusions. I want to say that, of course, being a parent was a very difficult situation, and being a mother became even more difficult because of the multiple roles that women had to take upon themselves, many times without their spouses, not because of choice, but because of the situation that occurred, and that they had to take care of the home, and many times, in particular in some classes of society, and when we move to the ghetto, the regular class structure really changes very much, and many people who were more affluent became quite poor or low middle class, and vice versa. So it is important to remember the issue of society structure, of classes, or what they called in another article, the periphery and the center, or the margin and the center in the Jewish society. What is extremely important to remember is the concept of home that was really destroyed in many respects, in particular for these people who were more in the periphery of the ghetto society, or of those people who moved out of the territory of the ghetto, from their homes into the territory of the ghetto, and were unable to get the place to live, the apartment as it was before. On the other hand, also those who were, let's say if we are talking about Warsaw Ghetto, who were still living in the area of the ghetto before the ghetto was constructed or was enclosed, they had to house in their family, in their apartment, many more families, many times people that they didn't know, many times people that were even not from Warsaw itself. And we know that in some cases, an apartment or a room in an apartment could house 7, 10, 5, 6 people. And the situation, of course, of crowdedness created really a very difficult reality to do and to provide for the basic things of the home. We should remember that cooking had to be managed between a number of women that, as I said before, were forced to share the same place. Women who observed religious rules found it even more difficult. Cleanliness and the whole issue of hygiene became extremely difficult. In any case, the houses and many apartments in the Warsaw Ghetto, or in Warsaw, in the Jewish sector of Warsaw, even before the ghetto, did not have streaming water, did not have the toilet within the apartment. And now when all this happened and you had so many people living together, the issue of cleanliness became extremely difficult. Washing, hot water, getting soap, and all this put a great toll on the basic responsibility of a mother, that was to take care of the home, to take care of her children, and to be able to raise the children, that they will continue the tradition and prepare them for the society, things that seem to be imaginable in the situation, in the new situation of the ghetto. We have, of course, to remember that affluent societies, families, had a different situation. And for example, when we are looking at Mary Berg's very famous diary that I'm sure that all of you know, when she is describing her life, they moved from Lodz to Warsaw. The father was an art dealer. The mother had an American passport. Finally, they managed to get out of the ghetto in a very late stage. But they lived in quite a comfortable situation, while, of course, there were still many changes from their previous life in Lodz. However, the mother still could have a maid in the house, they were not hungry, and the mother hosted 2 families of refugees for lunch every day and was very much involved in taking care of refugees. We have to remember that many, many people left Lodz and escaped to Warsaw. Some were deported, although not from Lodz to Warsaw, but others were deported from other places around Warsaw. And there was a kind of Landsmannschaft that was created of the lodgerers in Warsaw, and she was very active in it. We know also from the writing of Cecilia Slepak that interviewed 16 women in the Warsaw Ghetto, that this Landsmannschaft, I call it Landsmannschaft, although this was not the name that was given to the organization at the time, really was very active. Even Ringenblum writes on the same woman that Slepak interviewed and mentions her activities and mentions her initiation and her priorities to help people. We are talking here on affluent families and affluent mothers. Mary Berg mother still had the Mary Berg at home. She was a young teenager. The other woman did not have, her children were already young adults. So here it is quite a particular situation. Still you were worried also about your young adults, about the situation of how they will manage, but it is different than having smaller kids at home. On the contrary, just opposite to this, we read a testimony of a nurse from the Ringenblum archive in Warsaw, and I will read this to you. It is a translation from Polish. Recently, I live in the Jewish neighborhood in a poor house. I don't know the tenants, but understand that they are all poor. It is a house where the amount of dirt is enough to develop contagious disease. One evening, before I went to bed, someone knocked on my door. It turned out to be that the representative of the house committee was sent to me with a request that I give an injection free of charge to a sick 3-year-old child. Of course, I had no choice and I go where I'm needed. I know from experience that the poor have no hot water and no stove, so I boiled the water and prepared myself at home where I live, cleaned my hands and hurried to the place. I assumed a child might get pneumonia. It turned out that the situation was not so difficult yet. It was just a shot of comfort for reinforcement. I followed the lead. Total darkness surrounded me. We arrived at the place at the bottom of the house, no electricity. A kerosene lamp is lit in the corner. In the meantime, I neither see nor hear the child. Someone take the lamp toward the bed. Now I see a body. The child is lying, covered with a blanket without bedclothes, wearing a dirty shirt. In such moments, I am completely lost. I do not know how to react. I feel that there is no place to lecture on cleanliness, hygiene, etc. I want a cotton wool. The child mother is not found. She went to do laundry with a richer neighbor. Nevertheless, she arrived at the moment, and when I ask her for a cotton swab, she wants to give me a black cotton swab from the lining of the child's coat. I get angry, and it probably helps, because in the end, she gives me a cotton wool and even iodine. I ask that they light the place for me, so for the injection. Finally, I breathe a sigh of relief. I did my duty. I'm going home. I ask that they inform me in the morning to do another injection. Of course, I don't have anyone in the morning. No one is interested in the sick child. I can't go to work without visiting the child. I go down to the bottom of the building and shout for them to open the door for me because it's dark around me and I can't find the place. At the end, the door opens and I enter. Darkness. Again, I see no one. I ask for the second vial of injection. They do not have it. It broke. What should I do? I give money and ask to buy a new one. I am nervous because no one is coming. Finally, someone arrives. I already have the vial and something very good, a candy. I can do the shot. I look around. In the corner, two dirty children covered with rags are lying in the straw. In the second corner, there are also two children. An older boy holds the candy. The mother appears and picks up the sick child. She tries to clean it. The child is completely covered. That's enough for me. I found a clean place to make the shot. I have tea with me, which I distribute to the children. I'm going. All this is enough for me. The boy's mother went to the laundry and left me. I hurry to go. This is, of course, a very difficult description and a very painful one. And we ask what were the choices of this mother. Being alone with 4 children in this dreadful situation, and we really have to stretch our imagination as historians to construct a story for such a family in the Warsaw Ghetto. And of course, there were many families, and we know about what is called the Punkten, the centers of the refugees, how the situation there was. Another mode of description and narration comes from the writing of a youngster, again, a very well-known diary of Shirakovia.
I'm sorry, Dalia, can you hear me? Dalia,
yeah.
Could you please wrap up? You have,
okay.
One more minute.
Okay. So I will not describe Shirakoviak's because it is quite well known and how he describes his mother. That was again not situation of such a poor refugee, but really most of the people in the Lodz ghetto, and she was able somehow to keep it as long as she thought that she's really working for her family. And I will end up with a quotation from completely another place, from a woman, as I mentioned before. Her name is Esther Luria. She is an artist. She was in Palestine. She went to visit her family in Kovno and was caught in the war, could not go back. And in her diary that she published after the war, what she wrote it in the ghetto, she wrote, I couldn't stop wondering how delicate women who were often ill in the good days became strong under these conditions. In particular, women who had children had to mind their energies. And one can say that children prosper in the ghetto. The only joy that was left for parents were children. And if we remember that so many mothers were left without the spice, all that was left for them were the children. They were ready to risk their life for children without thinking twice. The fact is that women in the ghetto demonstrated more energy and larger adaptation to the harsh conditions than men. In most cases, women were the providers for the family. So if I'm going back to my beginning, and I had 2 more examples, and I want to say that we also have examples of mothers that left their children by the places of the self-help organization, or left their children and lived, and we have a few testimonies about it. We have testimonies of women who consider to give poison to the child when they are in hiding and the child is crying. And we have the testimonies, I couldn't of course bring them all. So we have a variety of ways which mothers try to manage. And if we remember Kalmanovich, what I quoted in the beginning, we should ask what were those baggage of norms and values that made mothers able or disabled to continue and care for the family during these difficult times. And I think that we should certainly remember different features of personality, social class, being in the center or in the periphery of the society, but also what is carried with them, and they understand their basic duty, mission, importance as being a mother. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dalia. Thank you very much, Professor Ofer. And we now turn to our second presenter in the panel, Micaela Procopio, who is a PhD student in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Gratz College in the US. Micaela received her master's degree in public history from the American University. She worked as the digital education manager for the US Army Women's Museum, and she taught at the US Naval Academy. Micaela's research focuses on clandestine abortions performed in the ghettos and concentration camps during the Holocaust, so a topic that she will share with us today. And she's also very much interested in enlarging Holocaust education in the United States by creating pedagogical tools for middle schools to university level. So, Micaela.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you, but we cannot see you yet.
Well,
Just one.
I don't know about that.
That's on our end. Just a minute, please. Okay. All right, we can see you. We can see you, so you can start.
All right, perfect. Hi, everybody. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I'm very excited to be here and present my paper. Thank you, Joanna, for the lovely introduction. This paper will focus on abortions that occurred specifically at the ghetto Theresienstadt, built on my research on oral testimonies and memoirs from survivors of Theresienstadt. These women have communicated in their testimony and memoirs that pregnancy meant immediate death. And these women were faced with an impossible, choiceless choice and chose to undergo an abortion in the hopes and efforts of prolonging their chance of survival. With this choice, they not only aspired to live, but with the hope that survival meant they would be able to have a child later, again ensuring that Jewish life would ultimately endure. To understand why abortions occurred in the ghettos and why the focus of this paper is on Theresienstadt, I will trace the background of Nazi racial policy towards the Jewish people and their legal stance on abortion towards Jewish women. I will then look at the establishment of the Theresienstadt ghetto and its differences compared to other ghettos at the time, including the clinic in the ghetto. The study of abortions in Theresienstadt helps us understand this particularly unique and vulnerable experience that Jewish women experienced during the Holocaust by restoring agency to these women who underwent the procedure, as well as the risk these medical professionals provided in an attempt to resist Nazi law, but to offer a chance at life for however long it may be. To trace how abortion became outlawed in 1943 in the Theresienstadt ghetto, we must first understand the beginning of these reproduction laws for both Aryan German and Jewish women in Nazi Germany. In 1933, the law for the prevention of genetically diseased offspring legalized compulsory sterilization for those who the Nazis determined to be genetically inferior from inherited diseases, feeble-mindedness, and physical defects. It also allowed for the Nazi government to legally sterilize large number of Jewish people, although those who were mentally disabled were the first victims in the Nazi eugenic war. The law of protection for German blood and honor emphasized the earlier sterilization law. Nazi Germany encouraged the procreation of pure Aryan children while attempting to limit Jewish births. Furthermore, Hitler and Nazi Germany made it illegal for a pure German woman to seek an abortion. For Hitler and the Third Reich, it was a German woman's duty to reproduce for the nation. In 1942, however, sterilizations and abortions were no longer permitted for Jewish women, as the final solution was now in motion. These women would be killed. In 1942, the Nazis placed a ban on births in the ghettos as a method to extermination. Hitler said, quote, "There are many means by which a systematic and completely painless extinction of the undesirable races can be attained at any rate without blood being shed," end quote. Banning births was one of these means. In the Eichmann trial of 1961, Adolf Eichmann was convicted on one of his indictments, directing that births be banned and pregnancies interrupted among Jewish women in Theresienstadt. Theresienstadt, or Terezin in Czech, was a unique ghetto during the Holocaust, often referred to as the model camp or camp ghetto for its many uses by the Nazis during the Holocaust. In 1941, the Nazis established a ghetto in the old garrison town of Terezin, located an hour north from Prague, as the holding center for the Jews of Bohemia and Moravia, as well as Jews from Denmark and the Netherlands, as a transit camp en route to the extermination camps. Although Theresienstadt ran in practice as a ghetto and a transit camp, we all know it was also used for propaganda purposes by the Nazis to present a model Jewish settlement. The Theresienstadt camp ghetto existed from its use as a ghetto in 1941 until its liberation on May 9, 1945. While Theresienstadt had functions that made it appear like it was this model Jewish settlement, the ghetto was riddled with disease, poor hygiene, lack of food, and lack of adequate care. This is particularly demonstrated by the doctors and nurses who worked tirelessly to provide care to their fellow Jews in Theresienstadt. The structure of Theresienstadt followed other ghettos in that the highest branch was the Jewish council led by the Jewish elder. And Theresienstadt stands out among the ghettos for having an effective Jewish self-administration. The SS were slightly interested in the day-to-day operations of the ghetto. The self-administration aspect of the ghetto was created by the SS, but it grew organically, allowing these Jewish functionaries a sense of agency. However, the ultimate goal of the Nazis was that Theresienstadt was a gateway to the east, a step along the trail towards ultimate destruction. The ghetto had 8 main departments, each with one head and following deputies. The 8 departments were administration, internal administration, the central labor, the technical department, the economic department, youth welfare, and health services. The health services was one of the first departments to be established in the ghetto. Erich Munch headed health services until his deportation to Auschwitz in fall of 1944. Richard Stein, an ophthalmologist, succeeded him. Immediately upon the arrival of the first transports did disease arrive. There was no medication and no supplies, a reoccurring theme that would exist for the duration of the ghetto. The 3 founding doctors of the department set up medical rooms in the first 2 barracks, Sudeten and Dresden. In April of 1942, the Dresden barracks was turned into a surgery. At this point, the SS ordered the old military hospital in the Hohenelbe barracks to be turned into the ghetto hospital. The barracks became the central location of health services, and over the next few months, medical services developed. In its early stages, there was no equipment, and doctors and nurses went out in search of beds, tables, and chairs for the hospital. Each barrack in the hospital had its own medical unit, infirmary room, and equipment. By May 1942, health services was run by a chief physician with 4 separate blocks that each held its own internal administration. It was the second largest unit in the ghetto with, quote, 4,066 workers, 8 hospitals with 2,500 beds, 5 large senior homes with over 3,000 beds, 635 physicians, and 1,432 staff members. The size of the medical department was needed because at any given time during the existence of Theresienstadt, the percentage of ill residents was high. During the spring and summer of 1943, the number of ill persons rose to 12,000 to 15,000 in a town of 46,000 residents. In fall of 1942, the number of prisoners in Theresienstadt reached its peak with 58,491 persons, and the health services included the main hospital along with the following units: internal medicine, the surgical ward, an operating room, laryngology, ophthalmology, gynecology, urology, dermatology, cardiology, x-ray, a laboratory, and an infectious disease unit. Quote, there was on average 1 inpatient bed for every 11 people. This did not include the thousands of helpless patients crowded into the living barracks of the ghetto. There were over 600 physicians in the ghetto, but there was a larger number of nurses, comprised mainly of women who had very little or no training. There's approximately 1,583 nurses, according to Adler's book Theresienstadt. There were 87.5 patients per physician and 31 per nurse, and this statistic refers to the time around September 1942 and is subject to change in the following years regarding deportations and new arrivals and deaths of both physicians, nurses, and those who were ill. Some Jewish women acquired basic medical knowledge in nursing courses that were organized by their Jewish communities. However, the number of registered and professionally trained nurses to the ghetto was low. Almost all the registered nurses deported to the ghetto were immediately assigned to work at these hospitals. Many of these nurses worked long days to provide even the simplest medical care to their patients. Younger women who lacked the experience and professional training worked as nursing assistants, although they had a high turnover. Abortions occurred frequently in Theresienstadt, and it is easier to track the number of abortions that occurred after Anton Berger took over command of the ghetto in July 1943. Berger's tenure as commandant of Theresienstadt was the shortest, from July 1943 until February 1944, but it was marked by some of the most brutal orders. Berger ordered that any woman who became pregnant had to undergo an abortion, and any woman who did not follow the order was to be deported with her newborn child. It is not sure why Berger implemented this rule, considering that Theresienstadt was a transit ghetto, and most women were aware that pregnancy meant immediate deportation to the east. Berger's successor, Karl Rahm, upheld the rule until December 1944, when it was softened to a certain degree when Mermelstein was the elder. Quote, the house elders had to keep track of the menstrual periods of all women inhabitants born between 1889 and 1928. The newly arrived women prisoners were checked for pregnancy, end quote. And this was incredibly difficult to keep track of, as a substantial number of women did not menstruate or receive their periods regularly while in Theresienstadt. Numerous female survivors mention in their oral testimonies or memoirs that their menstruation stopped upon arrival in the ghettos or camps. Thus, it was difficult for sexually active women to know if they could conceive or become pregnant. Pregnancies did happen in Theresienstadt, oftentimes as an accidental result, but not always out of complete carelessness. Many couples sought comfort and intimacy in a place where their fate was unknown. The reaction to seek comfort was a method to deal with the traumatic situation and hopelessness that many couples found themselves in. While marriages had been made illegal in the ghetto as a way to stop pregnancies, there were still couples who married in secret. Couples also engaged in sexual intercourse as a way to express love, hope, desire, and comfort in a period where those all but ceased to exist. Towards the end of the war, many couples took the risks associated with sexual intercourse, hoping to reach liberation before the 9th month of pregnancy. Hilda Pullman, a young Berlin nurse who was dating one of the older Jewish physicians in the ghetto, found herself pregnant. Quote, I suddenly felt restless and nauseous. I visited a gynecologist to be certain. The self-administration provided a barrack where they performed abortions, assembly line style. I immediately registered and stayed there for 2 days. End quote. The pregnancy had to be reported and the abortion had to be approved by the chief physician monk. Quote, interestingly, while many physicians and other chroniclers described abortions as particularly wrenching, using terms of genocide, many of the women in question described their pregnancy and abortion as Pullman did, as an inconvenience to be got over. End quote. Dina Gottlieb Babbitt, well known for her famous paintings of Auschwitz, sought out an abortion herself while imprisoned in Theresienstadt. While recounting how pregnancies were interrupted in the family camp at Auschwitz in her oral testimony in the Shoah Foundation, Babbitt volunteers to her interviewer that she herself had an abortion while at Theresienstadt. Quote, I was pregnant in Theresienstadt with Karl, and I had an abortion. It was no big deal. In Theresienstadt, it was done all the time. Nobody wanted to bring a baby into that situation, even before we knew it would mean our lives as well. End quote. Babbitt's testimony points to the agency that these women were able to maintain, alluding that many women saw it as impossible to bring and raise a baby in the environment they were living in, before directives even came down that pregnancy meant deportation and subsequent death. Many of the doctors, nurses, and women themselves saw abortions as a necessity because it meant survival for the mother. Ruth Elias became pregnant in Theresienstadt in December of 1943, but was unable to find a doctor willing and able to abort the fetus. A new regulation in the ghetto changed the August 1943 directive to abort all pregnancies was now prohibited abortion in the ghetto. The registered nurses in Theresienstadt had to assist in the performance of medical procedures in the hospital, as noted by survivor Vera Katz-Schiff. Nurses, including Lily Sabetka, played a role in performing the abortions in Theresienstadt, usually conducted without anesthesia in an attempt to save the pregnant women from deportation. Quote, abortions were executed in all sorts of conditions which nobody would have performed today, even under the best conditions, and the sanitation then was extremely poor. End quote. Despite the conditions of the hospital and the ghetto, hundreds of women sought out abortions. Vera Schiff stated in an interview to the author in March of 2023 that she assisted in performing hundreds of abortions. In spite of the directive prohibiting abortion, doctors and nurses continued to provide them under threat of deportation in the slight chance that they could help save the individual woman. In the case of Theresienstadt, abortions were not rare. They occurred frequently, and due to the order of Anton Berger, were easier to track in 1943 until 1945. However, Theresienstadt was unique in many other ways. It was the only ghetto that lasted until liberation and is regularly referred to as the ghetto camp or model ghetto. And these labels partially explain why Theresienstadt was different from the other ghettos. For the most part, the significant aspects of Theresienstadt are comparable with the other ghettos. In regards to abortions, this paper has focused singularly on Theresienstadt as part of a larger research project to demonstrate the specifically gendered experience that Jewish women had during the Holocaust. It explores how abortions in Theresienstadt were unique due to the changing law on the legality of abortion in the ghetto. Theresienstadt has been a particular case study and has demonstrated that abortions did occur, and they occurred at repeated rates, illustrating that these women made a choiceless choice to prolong their lives in the hopes that they would reach liberation. Scholarship has shown that differences in gender did not determine whose suffering was worse, only that there was a difference in experience. For women, they were susceptible to differences due to their biology. Studying women who underwent abortions, as well as those who performed them, adds another layer to the complexity and impossibility of choice during the Holocaust, but also adds another dimension of agency and bodily autonomy to these women. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Micaela, for your presentation. And now we turn to the last but not least presentation of this panel and of the day, to Tiarra Cooper. And Tiarra is a PhD candidate in the German Studies program at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst in the United States. Her dissertation will be defended in May 2024. Yes, okay, there's a date for that. And the dissertation is titled Women's Experiences of Forcible Sterilization Under the Nazi Regime, 1933 to 1945. Tiarra received numerous prestigious fellowships to pursue her dissertation research. She is currently an instructor in the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program at the University of Massachusetts, where she teaches about courses on race and sexuality, gender and culture, and decolonization through indigenous knowledge. Fascinating. So, Tiarra, I welcome you to present your paper now.
Sure. Oh, I should have a Prezi presentation. Should be a link. Okay. I'm especially fond of this laser, though. I'm very happy
Okay, there you go.
There we go. Oh, wow. Let me back up. Hold on. You can start with, actually, does this work for it? Clicker? Okay. There we go. All right, now we can start. Let's see here. So My presentation today is Probing Female Holocaust Survivors' Fertility, 1948 to 1922. The beginning date seems a bit dubious, especially given that they weren't survivors yet, but I will get to that momentarily. In the decades following the war, politics of reparations and claims of war-related damage converged in ways that centralized survivors' fertility as a new site of investigation. More than a condition that occurred organically, infertility became the language through which to articulate gendered bodily damage stemming from Nazi persecution in camps and ghettos, whether attributable to sterilization or otherwise. Amenorrhea, the condition during which a woman does not menstruate for at least 3 months, had impacted the majority of women in places and spaces of duress. This included concentration camps, ghettos, and prisons, though it could just as easily impact a woman in her own home under the right conditions. After the war, however, when menses did not quickly return, the absence of a period became enmeshed with the politics of reparations. In this context, amenorrhea became indicative of infertility resulting from women's persecution in the camps. Today, I'll present briefly on the condition of amenorrhea, after which I'll touch upon how menstruation and reproduction were understood by female survivors after the war. With this foundation, I'll then present a periodization of the fertility studies conducted on female survivors, all of which were based on the absence of menstruation. Without any demonstrable infertility, physicians came to conduct dozens upon dozens of fertility studies on the Jewish woman's body and later grounding national reparations. This presentation traces the contours of these studies, noting the historical context in which they emerged and their characteristic traits. There we go. All right, so what is amenorrhea? Secondary amenorrhea is the absence of menstruation when caused by exogenous factors. In other words, a person with secondary amenorrhea has already experienced their menses previously, but now it's ceased for at least 3 or more months. This can happen due to low body fat, low body weight, low caloric intake, even stress. In the most basic terms, it's the human body shutting down non-essential functions as it prioritizes survival. In more complex terms, this stress can disrupt the hypothalamus pituitary ovarian axis, HPO. The hypothalamus regulates the release of gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH, which triggers the pituitary gland to release 2 important hormones for menstruation, FSH and LH for short. In short, these 2 hormones travel to the ovaries and regulate another 2 hormones, estrogen and progesterone. Whether you're attributable to stress or low body weight or low caloric intake, the women persecuted under Nazism in a number of texts, testimonies, and recollections often contended with amenorrhea. Though it may sometimes accompany infertility, amenorrhea in and of itself is not indicative of such. One could, in theory, become pregnant while experiencing amenorrhea. We see this in instances after the war during which women thought themselves safe to have sex without the possibility of pregnancy, only to discover that that was indeed not the case. As an extreme example, we have here the doctor's report for Sylvia Vesela. As a prisoner nurse in Block 10 of Auschwitz, she herself was sterilized. In this report, the doctor writes that the patient did not menstruate during her time in the camps and that after her release, her menses were still irregular. Vesela, to her unpleasant surprise, became pregnant after the war. She was one of the 57 women known to have become pregnant after Klauberg's experimental sterilizations. This is one of the many instances in which absent or irregular periods were understood as infertility and with poor effects for women themselves. Without repeating the claims of established scholarship, it should suffice to say that women in particular held very deep fears that if they survived the camps, they'd be unable to reproduce, concerns that male survivors have yet to publicly and widely document. Faced with amenorrhea, many did not understand its etiology. Some internalized the circulating rumors of experimental sterilization, while others claimed additives were being covertly added to their food. Generally, amenorrhea was both welcomed and feared. Risk and poor hygiene accompanied menstruation, though its cessation was often interpreted as an indicator of infertility, permanent or otherwise. Many women, as we know, also subscribed to the bromide myth, the belief that bromide, or in some cases saltpeter, was added to the food to induce sterility, and pointed to their cessation of menses as proof. The ingestion of bromide, referred to as brum or brom, reportedly resulted in effects ranging from amenorrhea to lethargy, complacency to depressed sex drive, from infertility to sedation. Despite this range of purported effects of this additive, testimonies and recollections from men and women alike speak predominantly to the use of bromide to cease women's menstruation. One can see how after the war, reproduction represented a, quote, victory over the German curse, a return to normalcy, and in some cases, even vengeance. It's through the groundbreaking scholarship of Bettina Grossman, Judith Tidor-Baumel, and Margaret Myers-Feinstein, among others, that we know DP camps had some of the highest birth rates in the world, and that the optics of reproduction and reparations became deeply intertwined. In short, women had demonstrated their interest and ability in reproducing, which is why the decades of fertility studies seem at this juncture to raise the question, why? The first publications on amenorrhea in the context of the Holocaust, also known as war amenorrhea, deportation amenorrhea, and ghetto amenorrhea, were authored by Jewish physicians in the ghetto. Here, doctors documented the phenomenon that they were witnessing and speculated as to its etiology. Women had approached doctors in the ghettos inquiring why their menses had stopped. Doctors from the Theresienstadt, Kovna, and Vilna ghettos were said to have argued with one another, debating whether the occurrences were attributable to hormone excretion, emotional stress, or vitamin deficiency. In the Theresienstadt ghetto, physician František Bass, I'm sure I'll mispronounce many names today, documented in December 1943 that due to the onset of amenorrhea upon arrival, the condition could not be due to malnutrition, but rather, quote, from an indefinable psychological shock manifest in the cessation of ovulation. In the Kovna ghetto, on the other hand, physicians Yakov Nachimovsky and Aharon Peretz spoke to changes in women's endocrines due to labor and stress. Despite doctors having researched and reported on amenorrhea during World War I, the phenomenon appeared new. The astounding rates of amenorrhea were nothing like many had ever witnessed before. Divorced from their publications and larger medical communities, doctors never reached any consensus as to what was causing amenorrhea. As to the long-term impacts, this was not in question. Rather, doctors sought to document the condition and speculate as to its causes. In the immediate years following World War II, medicine was only starting to emerge from the shadow of the Nazi regime, a shadow that would continue to follow the medical field well into the 1980s. Here, physicians from formerly occupied countries, some of whom were themselves Jewish, sought to uncover the damages and permanence of those damages as they rebuilt communities and nations. Surveying and examining both survivors and repatriates, physicians sought to gauge the extent of reproductive damages and publicize and politicize their findings. As for the patients themselves, all were women who had sought out doctors in order to understand their absence of menses. Neither pregnant nor breastfeeding, they sought answers. Studies from physicians in formerly occupied countries, such as the Netherlands, France, and Hungary, were deeply political in nature, whether in their findings or their own personal convictions. In the Netherlands, Jeltje Eckert-Stroink, a gynecologist and member of the anti-German political group, the Dutch Union, looked to the impact of war on those employed in the medical profession. More specifically, she surveyed 130 female nurses and caretakers in university clinics on their menstrual cycles during wartime. In France, Louis Koppelmann was commissioned by the Secretary General of the Comparative Pathology Society of Paris to evaluate the menstrual patterns of female survivors stationed in a deportees repatriation camp. Similarly, in Hungary, physicians Cornel Horváth, Camillo Szalay, and Rejo Weisz examined 100 repatriated women in the Red Cross hospital and questioned them on the specifics of their wartime menstruation. The findings of Polish Jew survivor David Klebanow, though not framed by his politics, did so in his claims. As a practicing gynecologist, Klebanow witnessed, quote, women who were previously fertile, now they cannot become pregnant. They become pregnant and have many miscarriages. Motivated by these experiences, Klebanow conducted 2 fertility studies from which he deduced that the persecution and imprisonment in camps resulted in a 40% infertility rate for female survivors, a rate unmatched by any other study on female survivors' fertility. In contrast with the aforementioned studies, those produced by German physicians during this same period took a range of stances on the eugenic spectrum. It's a surprise not only that some physicians were permitted to continue practicing, but that they published their findings in guarded ways, even after the collapse of the regime. Heinrich K., formerly Heinrich Katz, for instance, was permitted to continue practicing at the University of Vienna, and then as a private gynecologist until the war's end. Given that an understanding with the regime could become tenuous at a moment's notice, he was, despite having published said study in the immediate post-war period, quite general in his claims. In 1946, he writes, for instance, that amenorrhea can be, quote, caused by vitamin deficiency and psychic worries and over-extraneous physical labor, but never names the ghettos or camps outright. Compared with the studies published by Jewish physicians, Karl Anselmino's eugenic convictions are much clearer. Publishing his findings on the women who visited his clinic, much like Martius did the same year, he distinguishes between an amenorrhea caused by, quote, being too nervous in the world and an amenorrhea triggered by hard labor and food shortages. The women in the first category, he claims, are not hereditarily valuable, while the second are. It follows that Anselmino does not mention the hardship, suffering, or murder occurring in ghettos and camps. Rather, he speaks to the presumably, quote, Aryan women who, unprotected and vulnerable, were missing their warfront husbands. According to Anselmino, for those suffering from amenorrhea due to endogenous factors, the cessation of their menses is nature's process of selection taking hold. As damages mounted in the wake of the Nazi regime, a stream of victims, advocates, resistors, and allies clamored to demand justice. They sought to evidence psychosomatic damages due to psychic trauma. Physicians and psychologists who were survivors or, quote, sympathetic doctors in formerly occupied countries endeavored to document the range of damages done to women's bodies. They demanded justice in their studies, drawing on the evolving scientific discourse on thyroids and endocrines, and presenting these findings at international conferences. Railing against the stringent criteria of the 1953 Federal Supplementary Law and residual Nazi affiliations in the medical field, these, quote, sympathetic doctors emerged in the 1950s, seeking to locate persecution-related damages in the survivor's physical body. It should be noted that while men were probed for somatic damage, only women were probed for reproductive damages. Moreover, traumatic psychic damages, later termed PTSD, were unaccounted for. If compensation were only granted due to physical damage, what would then be granted for the emotional, mental, and psychic toll of persecution? The study into women's fertility during this period demonstrated, when possible, links between psychic trauma damages and the cessation of menstruation. Moreover, what set these studies apart from those preceding is the focus on the endocrinological system in the menstrual and ovulatory processes. The 1950s and 60s marked a significant change in the medical and pharmaceutical industries. Importantly, the development of female sex hormones as drugs for menstrual and menopausal dysfunctions took center stage in the baby boom and infertility research of the 1950s. This meant, however, that women with irregular menses were suffering from deficient or defective hormones. a signification of female bodies that had begun in the 1920s with the discovery of gonadotropins. I'm skipping the rest of that one in the interest of time. This will be the last page with medical studies. Outside of Germany, politicized demands for reparations mounted as West German officials struggled to maintain a chokehold on application eligibility. The BEG, the Bundesentschädigungsgesetz, stringent criteria applying to residency and statute of limitations were enforced administratively, barring claims from Eastern Europe under the pretense of, quote, technical difficulties. In response, Polish resistors and survivors mounted relentless political campaigns against the West German government and even appealed to sympathizers abroad. While the publicized travels of the Ravensbrück rabbits culminated in a breakthrough for reparations to Eastern Europeans in 1960, the larger majority of Polish victims were forced to continue protesting empty-handed. Nearly a year after the rabbits visited the United States, the medical review Auschwitz came into publication. Issued by the Krakow Society, it was founded by doctors from the Krakow School who were either survivors themselves or sought to assist survivors. As an offshoot of the medical review, it dedicated itself wholly to the effects of persecution and imprisonment at Auschwitz-Birkenau and other camps. These demands quickly took new shape as these campaigns became entangled with the pronatalist policies of 1960s Poland. The first three studies included here touch on female survivors' fertility, for instance, with the explicit intent of reparation for survivors and for Poland at large. As a survivor of Auschwitz himself, Robert Weitz was clear in his 1963 study, stating that his intent was to, quote, provide proper treatment as well as establish grounds for disablement and pensions. In the interest of time, I'll skip to the very last slide, contemporary engagement. Contemporary research into the state of women's fertility post-liberation represented belated attempts to contribute to historical record and reassess opportunities for reinterpretation. As all female survivors are past reproductive age and the number of those living is painfully decreasing, opportunities for engagement on the topic are few. This period of studies includes Alfred Pasternak and Philip Brooks' The Long-Term Effects of the Holocaust and the Reproductive Function of Female Survivors, Alexandra Szabo's The Corporeal Continuation of the Holocaust, and Peggy Kleinplatz and Paul Weinling's Women's Experiences of Infertility After the Holocaust. The 2007 study published by Pasternak and Brooks was drawn from the surveys sent to Hungarian Jewish survivors in the 1980s. Looking at a cohort of 580 female Hungarian Jewish survivors, they deduced that 94.8% experienced amenorrhea during imprisonment, of which 82% ceased menstruation almost immediately upon arrival. The authors concluded that the fecundity subsequent to liberation was not significantly affected by the imprisonment, nor was there a significant increase in spontaneous abortion, ectopic pregnancies, stillbirths, or other pregnancy complications. They determined there were no long-term effects on female survivors' fertility after the Holocaust. Authored in 2020, Alexandra Szabo's contribution raises questions as to how we can interpret hereditary bodily damage. The corporal continuation of the Holocaust. Szabo questions how far we can think in terms of the continuation of the Holocaust in women's bodies if 1945 cannot be declared as an endpoint, and whether such a question could be sufficiently examined at all. And lastly, and most recently, Professors Paul Weinling and Peggy Kleinplatz contributed the most recent study to this scholarship, where they investigated the cause and permanence of widespread amenorrhea in Auschwitz-Birkenau. Having conducted over 80 interviews with survivors and their families, the authors concluded that the unusually high rate of miscarriage and pregnancies, combined with the reports of substances being added to the food, reveal a new working hypothesis as to what transpired within women's bodies in the camps. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to the three presenters, to Dalia, Micaela, and Tiarra, for engaging with this really difficult topic of motherhood and prospective mothers and mothers, right, with children. So I have my own questions, many questions, but I would like to open up the floor to questions from our participants. Yes, please.
I have two questions. One's for Micaela and one's for Tiarra. Micaela, sort of combining your presentation and Tiarra's, was there any evidence of any of the women who had abortions of having trouble conceiving if they survived the Holocaust? And then the other question for Tiarra is, was this therefore, what I'm understanding is this is the first time amenorrhea is being seen on a big scale, and was there anything that you read that suggested there were any studies of this done before the Holocaust?
Do you want me to answer?
Yes, you can answer. Yeah.
Okay. So as far as I've studied now, not really. In Theresienstadt, of the 21 testimonies on the USC Shoah Foundation that discuss this, all of the women went on to have children. Afterwards, Vera Schiff had a child, had multiple children. Dina Gottlieb-Babbitt had children as well. What would be more interesting to study is the women that had abortions in the camps, particularly the women that Gisela Perl performed abortions on. It's more depending if they actually, talk about it, right? So this is a whole multifaceted, complex question because most of it is based on their own survivor testimony. And that comes into question too of when their testimony is collected, who is it collected by? Does the interviewer, pose questions about this, and is the subject comfortable enough to answer that? And so that brings into a whole slew of things, right? And then even if a woman did have abortion, if she survived and then shared her testimony as well. And in Theresienstadt, even though we know that the conditions were horrendous, right, they are being performed essentially in a makeshift clinic with doctors, with nurses. And Vera says in her interviews that they would bring these women in and they would write them under, the slip as they were in the hospital for endometriosis, which meant that they had a 2-day stay, which of course the Nazis didn't really question, but then you would have, hundreds or at least tens of women showing up with endometriosis, which we even know now is not really something that can be cured by a hospital stay. So even though these are inadequate conditions, they are slightly better conditions than the abortions that, Dr. Perl performed in the barracks of Auschwitz. So it's a very interesting question. It's not one I have a concrete answer for, and one that I would be really interested to look into. But as far as my research has gone, most of these women have gone on to have children post-war.
Thank you. Do we have any?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
so the second part to that question. Do you mean, have there been women who had amenorrhea who did not have children afterwards? Or?
My question is was there any study of amenorrhea before the end of the Holocaust? Or was it more sort of one woman here or one woman there who had suffered from something, but had there not been any kind of big event that would have led to any kind of large study so that people knew what they were dealing with in the end of the Holocaust?
Actually, there was a giant wave of publications around World War I because the same thing happened. And so women's periods stopped. And all the publications from the male physicians themselves were, women want to be having babies and they can't, when now we know from scholarship from Karen Stuckenbrock that those women were actually really fearful about becoming pregnant because there were food shortages. It was wartime. But wildly enough, none of the corpus from this initial period in World War I was ever cited or used except for a few initial studies of Holocaust survivors. The rest remained ignored. And to make this even more complicated, because of the Cold War, because of World War II, all of these things, none of the knowledge between the studies that I presented, a lot of them didn't know about each other. They would all write like, no one else has ever written on this, and like everyone has written on this. And so it seems like the arms weren't talking to the legs in any capacity. And I think the same went with, I think a lot of the physicians that were practicing during World War I were either no longer practicing or they had been killed if they were Jewish. So there really wasn't any continuity between the two. It acted very disparate in terms of how this knowledge traveled over this time.
Thank you.
Yeah, I also have a question for Micaela. I was wondering, back then, abortions were very different than today, like in a regular setting and in a camp setting anyways. So for most women, an abortion was also life-threatening back then. Like the death rate of a woman going through abortion in the 1920s and 1930s was incredibly high. So I'm not 100% convinced with the argument that like an abortion was an option like for saving one's own life, because I think like the women were quite aware back then. So I don't know if you have numbers of the death rate of women who like underwent abortions and in camps, and if you have an opinion on that, because yeah, I think we shouldn't put our standards from today onto the context back then, and especially not the camp context.
Right. It's a great question. Basically, where I'm pulling the argument is from the women themselves, right? And it is very much, this might be cliche, it's very much between a rock and a hard place, right? That we know abortions back then contained these risks. And so these women are essentially trying to decide if, they carry the pregnancy and know that they're going to risk death, or do they try to go through this medical procedure and see if they come out. Gisela Pearl often pulled women that were pregnant and would convince them mainly to have an abortion, because she knew the risk that they would get pulled into the medical barracks and had injections into the fetus or wait for the baby to be born. And so she thought she was saving these women from a worse fate. Many of the women that did survive end up really like thanking this choice. The death rates, I don't have specific numbers. I'm actually collecting numbers still of women that did have abortions and survived. The problem is, if they died from an abortion, is it actually getting marked or classified as death from abortion, right? If Gisela Pearl, performed abortion in the barrack and a woman, died from the procedure, where was she going to put that record, right? I think, though, in a sense that these women, in their own words, have said that in whatever capacity they had to make a choice, which is not a choice, right? I'm not saying that they had full autonomy over their bodies or their situation or the environment that they're in, but they saw this as the best option in the situation that they were in, and they made that decision with the chance that this might offer some sense of survival. And I did actually ask Vera Schiff, about these abortions that she assisted with at Intraragenstadt, and she corrected me a couple of times because I am not a medical doctor, and this is a very intimate personal thing, but she says that abortion is actually a very simple and easy medical procedure. So she said it wouldn't be more of a risk than, the diseases that you would get or the lack of starvation. I can't check that, right? But in her terms, as a nurse, as a medical professional who did these things under these conditions, she's said that it is actually doesn't contain higher risk than some of the other risks that already existed in the ghettos.
Thank you. We have a question in the back there. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, I have a question for Micaela. First off, I just want to say I loved your presentation. Actually, this question is for Tiarra. I got the names confused. So, in terms of your study, did your study focus on the use of exogenous steroids on females in the Holocaust to induce primary and secondary infertility? And if it did, do you have an approximate number of how many women suffered from infertility due to the use of exogenous steroids?
So the studies that were listed here were all based on women who were not subject to experiments. So that was just on everyday women. There was one study out of Poland in which they did talk to women who had been sterilized. But are you referencing the scholarship of Weinling and Kleinplatz, who thought that there were hormones being added in some capacity?
Specifically, Peggy and Paul's study, the one that you listed on the last slide. Mm-hmm. I know it's a pretty recent study, so I was referencing that one.
Are you looking for my opinion on it, or?
No, specifically if you included their, the use of secondary steroids to induce infertility. I know that was a big thing in their study, so I was just wondering if that was included in your study, or
so I include it, and so I look less at the findings and more about the questions that we're asking, and that is what female bodies are reproducing and if they can, and what it can do for a nation. It's the questions that we're asking rather than the findings. Which is a very feminist science lens. There's something to be said about what we're asking from medicine and what we're looking for in medicine that tells us a lot about what we are seeking as people from other human beings' bodies. So I don't engage with any of the findings, but rather the conditions, the historical context in which these studies emerge. They tell us what people are looking for, and that's reparations. Because of Germany's chokehold on eligibility. And so it really forced people to take these other routes to try and find ways for restitution, reparations. And that can also be said for the Hungarian women who were sterilized, thanks to Bori Klashman, who I met at a symposium last year. She mentioned how a lot of women had lied about being sterilized in their files because that was the faster way to get compensated. And so there are literal, and I have them, literal thousands of files of women saying that they were sterilized at Ravensbrück, which wasn't physically possible. From what we know, it just absolutely wasn't physically possible, but they recognized that this was the route to get money faster. But I'd be happy to chat with you afterwards about the contents of that study.
Thank you.
Dalia, I wanted to ask you a question. Hi, Dalia. When women had to share a kitchen, I think you sort of alluded to it a little bit. Were there a lot of conflicts between women who were keeping a kosher kitchen and those weren't? And then were there any fights amongst the women?
There are not too many writing about it. There is more just about the conflicts between women who had to share the kitchen and how to divide the time, and complained that one took more time than the other, and so on. About women who kept the religious rules, there are less, in general, there are less testimonies about it, but some allude to it when they are talking about the general difficulties of what to do and how we give up and we are ready to eat non-kosher things because it's more important to have something to eat. And therefore also the issue of cooking is coming up about it. So I mean, I want to say in general about numbers that when we are talking about the Holocaust, there is very little ability to really have a kind of calculations of numbers. We have more to think of the themes that come up and to differentiate between different themes by different people or different memoirs or different writers. And I think that also on the other issues that were mentioned here, women in the first year after the Holocaust were very, very, how should I say, cautious to give much information that was connected to gender issues. And we must be very careful from really looking for statistics even after the war, certainly during the war years themselves.
Thank you, Dalia. I will use my privilege as a chair.
I think Beverly has a question.
Oh, okay. So, all right. So, Beverly.
Thank you. If I may just ask or comment on a few of the items relating to the amenorrhea. And I wish to endorse what Dalia has just said about collecting statistics. It's almost impossible. And also to remember that most of the women in the camps actually died, and we don't know what happened to them. But another comment about it is that amenorrhea occurred all over the place, not only in the camps, and not only those involved with any of the sterilization experiments. I mean, Micaela, you mentioned also it was in Terezin that you noticed, but I found it noted in almost everywhere that women went through the war and lived, that amenorrhea was a problem for all of them. I think the other thing we need to recognize is that there were multiple medical experiments that occurred, some only with a few cases at a time, some with 100 or less, as Paul Weindling is very well familiar with. And the document with Kleinplatz and the Micaela Weindling, perhaps, yes, maybe there was an experiment like that at some point. Did it happen to everyone? I doubt that it was something that was a practice that occurred or a medical experiment that was universally adopted throughout all the camps and all the ghettos where amenorrhea occurred. And I think the other last point I wanted to make is that we need to be careful not to conclude things arguing from correlation to cause, simply because somebody was in the camps or was in a ghetto or was part of a medical experiment, that their infertility later on or their abortions or problems with birthing later on were due to that fact that they experienced those things. This is an argument that says because I was in the camps or because I was in an experiment, I therefore became infertile. Infertility can occur from a number of problems. Miscarriages, loss of pregnancies are common experiences. Probably up to a quarter of all women who get pregnant have these experiences, and maybe more. So we need to be very careful not to argue that simply because the women were in these very difficult experiences, this was the cause for any of their maternity or reproductive problems in later life. It could well have been, but it could well have been something else altogether. PCOS, post-traumatic stress disorder, all the fact that they interpret their difficulties with reproductive life in later life to their experience during the war years. So it's almost impossible to identify a cause for later reproductive problems and to blame it only on the Holocaust experiences. This is really arguing from correlation. They were in the same place at the same time, and they correlated with whatever maternity problems they had later on. It's not necessarily a cause, it's a correlation. And we need to separate those two out.
Thank you, Beverly.
But thank you both, Micaela and and Tiarra and Dalia, your clarification as well. You've contributed to all of you have contributed to this issue and exposing it more fully. Thank you.
Thank you, Beverly, for your comment. And I know that Tiarra would like to respond. If any of the other presenters, Micaela and Dalia, you would like to respond, then you can do so after Tiarra.
So the contents of my presentation never claim any findings about any of this or any correlations. Rather, it's a medical history of the conditions under which these studies were done. So to repeat what I said earlier, I don't engage with any of their findings, let alone if they were correct or incorrect. I absolutely don't engage with it. Rather, why are they doing these studies? What political climate is necessitating these studies? And I do not engage with the findings because that's not my place, but also correlation, causation, it's less what I'm looking at and more at why are we doing these studies? Why are we asking these questions of women and women's bodies? What are we asking for them to do for us?
Sorry, Tiarra, this was not meant as a criticism in any way. It was a response to a question that someone asked from the audience. I think you've made it absolutely clear you are not correlating anything or making conclusions with statistics. It was a question from the audience that prompted that comment from me.
I see.
Thank you.
I see.
Micaela, you wanted to respond? Did I see it correctly or no? You're fine.
No,
Okay.
I think
Okay.
Beverly and Tiarra have
All
said
right.
it perfectly.
Okay. Does anyone else have questions? Right. Okay, Eva.
My question is, when you got the data from the Shoah Foundation, did you tell them you're looking for people who had abortion, and then they told you, they gave you like the 21 women that that said they had an abortion out of all the interviews?
There's different parameters. So if you've used the USC Shoah Visual Archive, you can, search by many different filters. You can set different search terms. I've done a variety of search terms. You can search specifically by ghetto, specifically by camp, specifically by nationality, by gender, and then you can put in search terms. And this is work that many of their probably indexers have done over years and years, where they have it into segments. And so it's indexed either by, menstruation, post-war life, pregnancy, childbirth. Abortion is just one of the many search terms that they have and that I've used. That's not always a fail-safe. And most of the time they're not transcribed. So I have to actually go through and listen to the hours of testimonies as well. And it's not just the USC Shoah. I've collected from Yad Vashem, from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Fortunoff Archive, the Neuberger Holocaust Center in Canada. And they all use different search terms, and they might not even come up under those search terms. So if it doesn't fall under any of those search terms, or it's not indexed, that might mean that, I miss out on it. So like Dalia said, it's very hard to collect statistics, right? Like it could be problematic for me to say, I have listened to 1,000 so-and-so testimonies where they all talk about abortion, and these are my concluding things, right? Because I think Dalia made an excellent point with the statistics that for these women, this was a very, and still is, a very personal and intimate thing that they had to experience in the harshest conditions, in a sense where, most of them have even alluded to, if this had happened not in the Holocaust, that they would have kept the child. And so I tried to keep that at the forefront of the research, but also, giving these women back some sense of the agency of the duress that they had to make and the choices that they did, in a sense, to survive.
The reason I bring it up is, because we're talking about, abortion here, abortion there. And, the reality is that there were not that many abortions that took place. It's just that when we talk about it in this context, it feels like there were so many abortions. So that's why I brought it up.
Oh, yes, there are not very many. And it would be hard to get a number. I mean, Adler's book on Theresienstadt says there I think he limits it between 200 and 300 abortions, but that's hard to fact check as well. Yes, absolutely. Sorry, I am not saying by any means that hundreds of abortions were happening day in and day out. It was usually something that these women were then forced to deal with as, the result of sexual intercourse. And it was maybe something they didn't foresee or another thing that they then had to deal with in these conditions. But great question. Thank you.
Thank you, Micaela. We have time for one more question. Yes, please.
Hi, how are you? Just inquiring. Can you hear me? I'm referring to the young lady. My mother wrote a whole research. My mother's name is Ruth Bondi. You must be familiar with it. And it seems to me, did you read it and establish some of your research upon what you read through it? Seemed familiar.
Yeah, Ruth is one of many things that I have read, and she was start of the foundation for the research as well.
Because not many researchers did the exact detailed research about the abortions, but my mother. She knew how to name names, and stories. But I didn't hear you say her name, so I wondered.
Oh, I'm happy to talk or email with you about it further. She is in my research. This is just a very small kind of gap. Ruth makes up most of my research in Teresian Shah, coupled with Vera Schiff as well, who you're familiar with. And I didn't mention Ruth in this paper, but she is part of the larger article.
Okay, we'll correspond. Thank you.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we are right on time. It's like 5:55. Thank you so much to our presenters, to Dalia Ofer, to Micaela Procopio, and to Tiarra Cooper for their fantastic presentations, and to all of you for engaging with questions and your comments. So thank you very much.